My name is Carolyn Cole. I'm from Penn State University, and I'm the product owner for Valkyrie.
I'm Trey Pendragon, a developer at Princeton University Library and the technical lead for Valkyrie. So before I get started, there's a lot of information here and I wanted to get kind of an idea of where we're at. So if you've heard of Valkyrie before today, please raise your hand. Dang, all right. If you've read the README before today, please raise your hand. Really? Okay. If you've launched it and used it either in an application or in a workshop, please raise your hand. Okay. So that's good because I'm not going to be able to get too deep into how it works. So first of all, what is Valkyrie? It was a gem written by the Data Mapper Working Group and a variety of other people, and the goal was let's make a library that lets us use whatever backends we want to use and still share the application code so that we can stop arguing about where we want to store things. If you imagine it in your stack, it replaces Active Fedora, and you can see our Samvera Labs repository right there. So some guidelines. So when the Data Mapper Working Group spun up, and as we worked on it, we tried to set some goalposts for what development of Valkyrie would look like. And these are them. So the first thing is, turns out documentation is more important than code. In previous libraries, we've had a hard time getting things like wiki tutorials and in-code documentation and things like that. So to work on that, whenever we do a community sprint or something like that, we build in like somewhere between 3 and 6 tickets that are purely fix the documentation on this, add more in-code docs, add more class documentation, write a tutorial for X, Y, or Z. And we think we do pretty good. There's still a few open tickets that'll show up on the next sprint, and we'll never be done, but that's just how life works. The library should be welcoming for developers to jump into. We've had similar libraries where there's been 1 or 2 developers who really understood how it worked, which meant that it was really hard to maintain, and those developers might feel like they were responsible for a lot, because they were. And another way we try to fix that is to use as much as possible from external libraries to expand our community rather than make it smaller. So Valkyrie is really just a wrapper on other libraries that exist and are in use by other communities. Valkyrie itself is dry schema. It uses dry types, which is another library to do things like casting between types. We'll talk about change sets real shortly in a second. Those are just reform objects and things along those lines. There are like little customizations to make it easier for our community, but by and large, they're just a wrapper over other libraries. And the other goalpost, which sort of evolved after this tutorial existed, but on the wiki for Valkyrie, we have a how do I migrate between adapters tutorial, and that's the whole tutorial. And the goal here is make the whole tutorial, those 5 lines, for as long as possible, because as soon as it's not, it means we've made the core, we've made decisions that broke our core design, right? We're here to make migrating and moving between different backends as easy as possible. And if it's longer than that, then clearly it's not as easy as possible. It comes up a lot for things like, maybe we should add an optional feature, but if I add an optional feature, then I have to check in this little 5-line script, so maybe we shouldn't do it. Or I'm going to add optimistic locking, and if I add it in this way, then my little 5-line script gets longer, but if I add it in this way, then I don't, so we do the other way. And things like that. So I would love to sit up here for an hour and tell you about all the intricacies of how the library works, but instead, I've got about 4 slides that gives you a rough overview. People seem to like this table. So it's a comparison of how something might work in Active Fedora versus how it works in Valkyrie. So in Active Fedora, if you need to find a thing, you do book.find. In Valkyrie, you pass it to a query service. which has a predefined set of number of queries to do the things that you're likely going to want to be able to do. To save a thing, you pass it to a persister instead of doing .save. To destroy a thing, it's another method on the persister. If you want to save to both Fedora and Solar, then we have tools in Valkyrie to combine different adapters so that it will do both at the same time but act like one. If you want to save just to Fedora, I legitimately don't know how to do it in active Fedora. And I've worked in the library for a long time, so I think it says something. But in Valkyrie, you just send it only to the Fedora one. If you want to save in Postgres in active Fedora, you clearly can't. Fedora's right in the name. If you want to migrate a schema, so if any of you have decided that actually I want DC creator versus another like predicate for that thing, it's like this script that probably queries Solar and goes through every object in your repository and does who knows what. But for Valkyrie, it's just 2 adapters with different configurations, and then you run that, and you finish your day. This is the first existence of a diagram of the technical stack of Valkyrie, so I hope it makes sense. On the far right, you'll notice the storage adapter and a file not attached to anything. We don't talk about these very often because they're really simple. Storage adapters handle persistence of binary content. It has like 4 or 5 methods, and files act like I/O objects and have an ID that you can add to your metadata store if you want. On the left side is metadata adapters, and these are a little more complex. They have query services with a handful of queries that you have to implement, along with a set of shared specifications that we ship that you have to make pass. And if you make them pass, then it means that you have a valid metadata adapter. Same thing for persister. There's only a few methods on it, things like save, save all, delete. And the core of the system is a resource. And a resource looks like this. And I promise it looks like this. Like, it always looks, it will never have a lot more than this. There's no validations, there's no callbacks, there's none of that. It's just purely what your schema is, define your types so that things will cast back and forth appropriately. And that's all there is to it. You can have as many of them as you want. You pass them to a persister and they'll save. You ask for them from the query service and they'll come back. If you need things like validations, if you need things like dirty tracking, which sounds worse than it is, then a change set, or what other libraries might call a form object, but we propose that you use it outside of HTML forms, and thus have called it a change set, will handle all of that, and you just pass a resource to it, and it will take care of things like validation and so on and so forth. And that way you can have different validations in different contexts, and there's a whole suite of benefits. What's time like? All right. So I don't expect you to read this. My only point here is that this is what the create action looks like, whether you're saving it to Fedora or Postgres or Solar or in-memory or some like nightmare Frankenstein combination of all of those. Whatever you've decided at your institution makes sense. It'll look like this, and we can talk about together as a community, like what do validations look like? What do we need to do to change this? What are the best practices for these kinds of things? We can talk about that and never get into a discussion about like where it actually goes. This is usually the part where somebody says, that looks great, but who's actually doing it? So we have 2. We have Cho. Do you want to give a quick summary of Cho?
Sure. So Cho is our cultural heritage object repository. It's a content DM replacement. We are currently working on it, so it is not in production, but we are on MVP 4, I believe. Is that correct, Adam? All right. And we've been actively using Valkyrie and have been enjoying it.
So there's also, we have Figgy at Princeton. It's called Figgy. It's in production right now. We have about 2.5 million objects running through it. Most of those are pages of books. So like the actual, like if you run the search results, it looks more like 60,000, but it's because every one of those has thousands of pages. Our developers are happy. I made sure I sent a Slack message beforehand that said, I'm gonna say that you're happy. Please tell me if I'm lying or not. And they said it's okay. They gave me the appropriate emoji responses. And number 3 is, I would really love if there was a number 3. You'll notice we're in the Samvera Labs organization, and the reason is we need one more person or one more institution to say that they're using this to develop a project, and then we can promote it. So next up, I'm going to give the feature in the last year. Carolyn's going to bring us into the future, and then we'll open up for questions. So in the last year, we released 1.0. Yay! Really what that means is we said that our API is now stable. We defined what our public API is. It's everything that has a shared spec. If you're not familiar with the concept of a shared spec, we publish these RSpec things that you can include in your own application and run against your adapters to make sure that they work. We have ones for adapters and resources and change sets and files, just to make sure that they fit the API as expected. We shipped with a Solr, a Fedora 4 adapter, an in-memory adapter, and a Postgres metadata adapter that was based on, they use Active Record underneath it. We also shipped with a disk, a Fedora, and an in-memory storage adapter so you can store binaries in either of those. I recommend you don't use the in-memory one. 1.1.0 was a really interesting release, released May 8th. It includes find by alternate identifier, so if you have noids or slugs or something like that, there's a generic way to handle that amongst all of the metadata adapters. And it adds a Docker development environment. These were interesting because they weren't the result of a sprint. They were just community members who decided to add features, and we added those features into a release. 1.2.0 just happened recently through a sprint between Princeton and Penn State. We added support for single values, so once upon a time you could only add arrays, largely because Trey had strong opinions. We added support for optimistic locking amongst all of our libraries. If you don't know what optimistic locking is, I can't explain it right now. We deprecated Active Fedora within Valkyrie, so it seems silly that to replace Active Fedora if we depend on Active Fedora. Included ID by default, which was just a small, nice thing. And we added support for ordered properties, so if you care what order your authors are in, it'll work in any of your adapters. Yay. Yeah. Another neat thing I wanted to bring up was, I think, a testament to the success of the simple, how simple the API is and how well we've done is that a number of community members have built their own plugins to this already, whether it's for different metadata adapters or different tools. There are ones for DynamoDB, Redis. We've spun one up that uses SQL instead of Active Record. Valkyrie Cloud Search, Valkyrie Active Record from Durham uses Active Record properly. So you could use MySQL or something like that with this adapter. Valkyrie Moab stores Moabs on disk. We have a Backend adapter in our repository at Princeton for storing bags. And some great work has gone in from Durham to make a generic benchmarking tool to compare the performance of various adapters against one another.
All right. right, so you've heard about what we've done in the last year, and now we're going to talk about what we're planning to do. And I really don't have a timeline on this because everybody's busy. We're looking to release 2.0, and what we're looking to do in 2.0 is to update the dry struct, which is one of the components that we're dependent on. They put some really nice things into a new release, but they're breaking changes, so we're going to do that in a 2.0 release. We're going to remove the active Fedora dependency. Of course, we want to remove that, but we deprecated it first so that the upgrade path would be easier. And then we also have a few other deprecations that we said, oh, we don't really want that in our system, but we don't want to do 2.0 right yet, so we're going to remove those deprecations. That's all we're planning for 2.0, so hopefully this will be a boring update. And then into the future, these are things that we're planning for after 2.0. We're looking at including the work that Princeton has done on Valkyrie-Sequel. This is a replacement for the active record adapter, and the reason that we'd want to do that is there are good performance enhancements, and it allows us to move away from the active record, save and save and save some more when you update. And the other nice thing about it is active record only allows you to connect with one database, and the sequel will allow you to connect with multiple. So that's a really cool trait. And I want to point out these issue numbers. One of the things that I think is making it easy for developers to get into the Valkyrie stack is that we've been doing a really good job, thank you, Trey, of making issues for all the things that we want to do. Trey mentioned earlier that we have issues for documentation, we have issues for writing tutorials, we have issues for code. And so when you get in there, you have a really good picture of what we want to do. It's not just in someone's head. And so I think that's pretty cool. So we have an issue here for looking into the SQL adapter. And then one of the other things we have right now is a Solr backend. And nobody's really going to use Solr as their primary backend for storage. A lot of times we're using it for search. So right now, the backend, you can put something into Solr, store it there, pull it back out of Solr, index it into someplace else. But it's not really optimized for searching, which is what people want to use Solr for. So we're looking into the concept of an indexer and how we can optimize the indexing into Solr. And so the indexer would be like a write-only adapter from Valkyrie. And then, you know, I was on the shuttle this morning, and Josh said to me, do you have a slide that says something about Valkyrie is rad and it's going to get better? So this is our slide. It doesn't say that exactly, but you know, it's performant. That's one of the reasons that Penn State chose it to work for Cho, because we needed to have a lot of data go in with a lot of relationships. And so, but our goal is to make it even more performant. So we're looking into solutions for the N+1 query, which is basically you've got one object and you need to get all of the children of that object. How do you get that efficiently? Right now, you ask for each one, but we don't want to do it that way. And then we also want to use the benchmarking work that's been done to benchmark the adapters and see how we can go ahead and make them more performant. And additionally, creating those benchmarks will help us to make sure we don't make them less performant as we add things into the future. And so, so you can tell Trey made a change to this between when I saw it last.
This is a real photo captured recently.
It was up in the hills when I was hiking. The Hyrax Valkyrie-Sequel came out of the woods, and I took this photo while I was hiking. So We wanted to put, and this has been mentioned a couple times before, but there's a lot of great work that's already gone into moving Hyrax onto Valkyrie so that people can choose their backends when they're using Hyrax. And there's a meeting today at lunch at 12:30. And I really can't tell you how to say the room number. I think it's floor 130, because 11,030 or 1,130 doesn't make much sense either. So I think it's floor 130, which is down here. And then we just wanted to say thanks. I mean, so this code would not exist without the community. And so this is an alphabetical list of all the people who have contributed to the code. And, you know, this community has allowed for this code to exist and come about. So thank you very much. And then, do you have any questions? And we also have, if you don't have questions now and you think of questions later, we have a frequently asked questions.
And you better have questions, because we have a long time.
Did we talk too quickly?
I think so.
Uh-oh. We started early, too. It's not our fault. No.
This is a bit of a technical question, but so you mentioned we're updating dry struct. Does that mean that we can't do those active record style validations that are currently a part of Reform? Post dry struct update?
No, nothing changes about that. The changes in dry struct are they changed sort of how they store the hash that powers a Valkyrie resource, as well as it turns out there were some missing APIs in Valkyrie for things like arbitrarily setting setting a property, and there were some assumptions about how Valkyrie resources worked if you set an instance variable that was equal to a property that have now changed, which means we need a major version. But all of the Reform stuff works the same.
I didn't see it on this slide earlier, but do you know, is anyone working on an S3 storage adapter?
There's a ticket that's existed in Valkyrie for a long time. I've heard interest. I mean, really what it is that we just don't have anybody who's actively working on Valkyrie that stores an S3. So the testing infrastructure for how to make sure that works. We just don't have the expertise in it right now. I've heard some interest in implementing it via a more generic active storage adapter, as well as a shrine-based adapter, which would also allow you to store to S3.
Since you said it, since you said active storage, this is a way out there question, but what about using Valkyrie as a replacement for active storage?
It's up to you. I think storage adapters and files, if you look at it in the generic sense, looks a lot like active storage. So I'm not sure what you would get out of it, really. It's really, the benefit of active storage is that it has tie-ins to the framework that are nice, right? It'll bind to your active record objects in a way that you might want, and things like that. I think the nice part about Valkyrie's storage stuff is it doesn't assume that you've got a relational database storing metadata about that file, where active storage does.
Two microphones. You sound very confident, which is great news for us, about the 1.0 release and its stability. That's fantastic. What optimizations in the future, however, do you envisage, if any? Do you have any in mind, or?
I do performance optimizations on the Valkyrie adapters that we use at Princeton fairly often. And I think that's sort of how it's going to go forward. The people, like, you need to use these adapters in production to know where the slow parts are. Like, and I think that's just the fact of the matter. So those will continue to improve. So far, every performance improvement we've done is we've been able to do as patch releases. We've never needed to change the API. So hopefully going forward, if you're involved, you should just be able to either implement the fixes that you see, or we can help, and it'll get added to a release. The only other piece of performance is, it changes depending on what the case is, but roughly 20% of the time is like dry struct changing your properties over to a Valkyrie resource, and those just get better as the library gets better.
Thank you.
Does everyone just want lunch? I totally get it.
So I know you said that you don't know when Valkyrie 2.0 is coming out. So I was wondering if you could comment on when you think Valkyrie 2.0 is coming out.
Okay.
In the next year, Valkyrie 2.0 will come out. How about that?
Yeah, so we have a branch that updates dry struct. The things stopping Valkyrie 2.0 coming out right now are our responsibility to our current implementers. So there are a couple of things that change that we would need deprecation notices about, or at least some sort of informational thing so that you could upgrade version 1 and fix whatever notifications you get, and then go to 2 and it'll just work. Because we feel like it's important to be nice in that way. And the other things are, I don't know, we just don't do major releases very often, so it's like a chance to think about what other breaking changes we might want to implement. Right?
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions?
Oh yeah, go back to that.
Come to that one.
So I was also asked to talk about the other working groups that are coming. There is the Samvera steering in here in gold. And then there's also metadata interest group, which is in floor 150 is how I'm gonna say it. So what they're hoping you do is go up, get your lunch, and then come back down. So that's it.
All right. Lunch is up there.